You're welcome, Neil. This is hell. Good morning, planet Earth. Manufacturing descent since 1996. Independent from independent radio. Alternative to alternative radio. This is not the media. This is hell. I'm your bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show host, Chuck Mertz. Like us on Facebook, where we have posted this week's question from hell for you, our listening audience. This week's question from hell for our listeners is in honor of last Saturday's Great Chicago Fire Festival. If you could burn anything to the ground until it was nothing but ashes, what would it be? Post your reply today, and the best one wins passes to the new Theater Oobleck show, Baudelaire in a Box, Episode 7, The King of Rain, and a special gift from Oobleck upon your arrival. Coming up on this morning's show, The Guardian's Tanya Brannigan is going to be on to discuss what's happening with the protests in Hong Kong. So if all you know about the Hong Kong protests is they're polite and have something to do with umbrellas, you'll want to hear from Tanya live in Beijing. Also on this morning's show, we will be speaking with Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy is the author of the book Capitalism, A Ghost Story. Couple of things in this morning's paper I wanted to mention to you real quick. We'll be discussing on this morning's show not only the win by Malala Yousafzai being honored with the Nobel Peace Prize, but also the protests in Hong Kong have returned. So, a couple of breaking news stories that are related to this morning's guests. The show is only 1 hour long this morning. While we would love to be here for 4 hours, we're being abbreviated by Northwestern University football again this week. So we just wanted to tell you that the show's only an hour. We're coming back to the 4-hour show on the 18th and a 4-hour show on the 25th. So stay tuned in for that. There's a new issue of The Baffler out, and they're celebrating with an event. The Baffler with Anne Elizabeth Moore and Rick Perlstein. They'll be speaking at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. This is happening on Monday at 6 p.m., 5751 South Woodlawn Avenue. If you want to find out more, you can go to the Seminary Co-op website, semcoop.com. That's SEMCOOP.com, SEMCOOP.com. So there's actually, it's a new book out. It's a collection of stuff from The Baffler, and they're going to be celebrating this again down at the Seminary Co-op on Monday. The Baffler, established in 1988, is a printed and digital magazine of art and criticism, appearing 3 times annually, spring, summer, and fall. They're headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and edited by John Summers. Past guests on the show, Tom Frank and Chris Lehman. Designed by Patrick Flynn, distributed by MIT Press, and Elizabeth Moore is an editor, artist, and author of Cambodian Girl, self-publishing in Phnom Penh. And Rick Perlstein is the author of the new book, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. And they will both be speaking at the Seminary Co-op on Monday. Arundhati Roy is the author of Capitalism, A Ghost Story. But the way Arundhati tells it, capitalism has been more a tale of horror for millions of people in India and tens of millions of people around the world. For many, capitalism is not a theory or an idea, but a frightening reality that tears apart their lives every day, and it's getting worse. Good morning, Arundhati.
Good morning.
It's great to have you on the show. On Monday, Arundhati is celebrating the Verso Books release of the classic of Indian Dalit literature, The Annihilation of Caste, by B.R. Ambedkar. Arundhati will be appearing on Monday, October 13th, in the Teachers College at Columbia University, 525 West 120th Street, in the St. Cohen Center auditorium at the Horace Mann building in room 147. Arundhati Roy, The Doctor and the Saint, is an event to celebrate the annihilation of caste, the classic of Indian Dalit literature by B.R. Ambedkar, with an extensive introduction by Arundhati Roy. You can get tickets at eventbrite.com. All you got to do is put in The Doctor and the Saint, and I'm sure it will pop up. Make sure you go to that event if you're in New York. I've talked to a lot of our listeners who said that they will be going to it, and you can find out more about her book as well as this event by going to haymarketbooks.org. Arundhati, yesterday's announcement of Pakistani Malala Yousafzai and Indian Kailash Satyarthi as co-winners of the Nobel Peace Prize led the Washington Post to report that this could, quote, kindle new hopes for peace on the South Asian subcontinent. And the Post specifically pointed to the potential impact this could have on the India-Pakistan conflict in Kashmir. What impact can an education advocate and an activist who fights child slavery have on the Kashmiri conflict? And if the intent was to have an impact on the Kashmiri conflict, why not give the prize to someone fighting for Kashmiri peace?
Well, this is so naive. If Nobel Prizes could bring peace, then we should be, distributing them like candy, right?
Right.
Please. It's this is in a way, I think we should remove the individuals from the story, because Malala, she's just a child still, so I don't want to, drag her into a critique. I mean, she has, in the past, I think, spoken out against the U.S. as well. But now she's been, this is all part of the great game. And it's just a foreign policy move, really, and not to bring peace or anything, but the fact is that, when the U.S. attacked Afghanistan in 2001, anybody with half a brain knew that it was going to result in a civil war in Pakistan, because the two are so intertwined, and the CIA and Pakistani intelligence had been involved in rearing this beast of wild fundamentalism, if you like, and now they were being asked to garrote their own pet. So, of course, Pakistan is now almost in a situation of, or is, why am I saying almost? It is in a situation of civil war. And the U.S., for whom Pakistan was an ally, is now looking to step back into what they think of as firmer ground, which is India. And so they need India and Pakistan to be friends, but without, like the issue of Kashmir, the Indian occupation is the most densely militarized zone in the world. Something like 68,000 people have been killed. Thousands have disappeared, mass graves, but nobody wants to talk about it, maybe because they haven't yet discovered oil there or something,
That is a horrible thing to say, but I completely agree with every word you said. You were saying Pakistan is in a situation of civil war. In capitalism, a ghost.
And let's not forget that both these countries have, nuclear weapons, and Kashmir is the flashpoint. Of course, Kashmir was inundated by a flood just a few weeks ago, and it's just been devastated. And the Indian government refused any help internationally, though it intervenes and tries to help people in other countries, but it refused help in Kashmir. It could not handle the situation. The army just did these kinds of sort of TV rescues, and the Indian press just concentrated on that, and the whole of Kashmir is just devastated right now.
And you were mentioning how you have to remember that both these countries, India and Pakistan, are nuclear powers. And this week, Pakistan announced that they are going to try to come up with a second strike capability where they will have nuclear weapons on submarines. So even if they lost their nuclear bases on land, they would be able to strike again. So clearly they are expanding their nuclear program. You were saying that Pakistan is in a situation of civil war due to the Afghanistan war. In your book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, it seems like you're pointing towards a possible civil war in India. All of these things want to come from a very selfish U.S. security standpoint right now. All of these things would seem to be undermining U.S. security or U.S. security interests abroad. So why would the United States promote the kind of policies that lead to civil war in India and Pakistan, in Afghanistan, when it seems like those things would be undermining our own U.S. national security interests?
No, it's a question of. I think it's a question of just not being able to read cultures and histories and ancient hostilities. If you sort of release an incubus in some short-term interest, it has these long, deep effects. Like for when I'm here in the United States, you imagine that the real way there is some conflict, like the ISIS has to be destroyed by American by the American security forces. It cannot be. It was caused by them, and the thing that they don't seem to understand is that once a situation of such chaos is unleashed, it becomes irrelevant. I mean, who is America going to arm? They can't tell one faction from the other. All the weapons just exchange hands. It isn't anymore about the United States. When was the last time the United States won a war? It can bomb places, it can create chaos, but it certainly can't win. From Vietnam onwards, when was the last time it won a war? And now ISIS is making out, of course, that ISIS is confronting the U.S., but in fact, its real enemies are the Shias and other Sunnis who do not follow its tenets, and of course the greatest source of this kind of fascism is Saudi Arabia, which is the United States' greatest ally. So, even to say that it's a war between democracy and radical Islam is ridiculous, because none of the regimes that are toppled are radical Islamists. I mean, nor Saddam Hussein wasn't, nor was Gaddafi, nor was Syria. So this is just foolishness.
How much do you think, now I know the name of your book is Capitalism, A Ghost Story, but how much do you think the wars in the Middle East that the United States has been behind, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, the bombing that happens in Pakistan, how much do you think this undermines the American ability, or the American brand, let's not say American, how much do you think this undermines the brand of democracy?
Well, I guess the trouble is that we are reduced to having to accept that all it is a brand now, It's a kind of product. There was a time when democracy was a real threat. So, democratic regimes, whether it was in Iran or whether it was in so many countries in Latin America, were toppled because they were real democracies, Chile. We know that history. And then it was taken into the workshop, for denting and painting, and came out as this product which was fused with free market capitalism. And then the wars were being fought to install these kinds of democracies because it ceased to be a threat, So in India, elections are celebrated every 5 years, and everybody's told, look at this great democracy, whereas it is a democracy for a few people. But for the rest, there hasn't been, for example, since 1947, when when British colonialism ended and another kind of colonialism began, there has not been a single year when the Indian Army has not been deployed against, quote unquote, its own people within the borders of India. Not a single year. And now there are, Kashmir, Manipur, Nagaland, Punjab, Hyderabad, and now the army, the paramilitary is surrounding the forests of central India, making war against the poorest of the poor because they happen to live in the forests where there is a huge wealth of minerals. And the agreements have already been signed, and so history is repeating itself. India wants to be play in the big league, and because it does not have colonies, it colonizes its own poor.
I am starting to wonder if there is a sustainable version of humane capitalism, especially after reading your book. We're speaking with Arundhati Roy, author of Capitalism, A Ghost Story. When you consider the millions displaced, land lost to huge infrastructure projects or privatization, or as in India, farmers moved off their land, hundreds of thousands commit suicide. They move into the city to find no hope, no jobs. They find racism. They find hatred. They move back to their villages, which are gone. They fight to get their land back that was taken by corporate paramilitaries, and they're called terrorists for doing so. Is there humane capitalism, and we've chosen the not-so-humane kind?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think so. I think it's time we faced up to it. That the kind of centrifugal force that this system creates. What can it do except increase the gap between the rich and the poor? And what can it do except arm the rich to attack the poor? Unless, for example, in India now, you have 100 people who own more wealth than 25% of the GDP. You have 800 million people living on less than, a few cents a day. And you have laws which make even thinking an anti-government thought a criminal offense. And you have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act where a non-commissioned officer can kill, like a soldier can kill on suspicion. Inside the borders of the country and not in a situation of war. All they have to do is declare areas disturbed, and wherever the army is deployed, this is going on. And you have thousands of people in jail right now. You have thousands of people dying in police custody, and now, of course, we have a new government, a prime minister who in 2002 presided over a pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat, and in which 2,000 were killed, women were raped and burnt alive. And in his campaign for prime minister, when Reuters asked him if he regretted what had happened, he said he would regret even running over a puppy. He refused to apologize. And then he came to Madison Square and spoke about global hygiene to screaming mobs of Indian businessmen, shouting Modi, 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 and this is the reality we live with now. This man who's creating an atmosphere of fascism. He belongs to a party called a cultural organization called the RSS, which openly worships Hitler and says things like the Muslims of India are the Jews of Germany. You have Muslims living in camps now, having been driven off their farms and lands. And meanwhile, he comes to America and tries to fuse himself with Gandhi and say, I believe in global hygiene. And of course, Gandhi was not a saint, but no one knows that here. That's
the thing that I was really surprised about. And I shouldn't say surprised. What what should it reveal to us when you have somebody who is elected prime minister of a nation like India? You have Modi elected prime minister. You have the United States in the past condemning him, saying, associating him with thoughts of the Nazis, like a Nazi ideology. Then as soon as he becomes elected, the United States drops all of those complaints, allows him to come into the country when he wasn't allowed in before. What should that reveal to us, either about the United States or about the way the geopolitics is played?
Well, look, the United States, first of all, your own president is involved in drone attacks and killing more people. It's just that some people are kind of hands-on and some people do it in a remote-controlled way by pressing buttons and looking on computer screens. So I'm not going to be, I don't care either way, whether he came or is allowed in or not allowed in. Plenty of killers have been allowed in here.
Right.
And the question is, the United States has a history of, from Hiroshima onwards, so how can I get myself worked up over whether yet another person with a very dubious reputation is allowed in or not allowed in.
So you are a reporter of the kind of inequality that takes place every day around the world and the harsh conditions of poverty that those on the bottom of that inequality suffer through every day and throughout their lives. Here in the States, inequality is not now only just becoming an issue that our political leadership is willing to exploit. Not that policies have been put in place to stop that inequality as it continues to grow in the U.S. To you, as an observer of poverty, as an observer of inequality, what does it say about the U.S. that inequality has been growing since the 1970s and is at its highest level since 1928, and it has not become a political issue? What does that say about the U.S., or what does it even say about India, where inequality doesn't seem to be addressed or an issue?
No, in India it is an issue in the sense
Okay.
that there are massive resistance movements,
Okay.
social movements. There's battles. I mean, there are guerrillas in the forest.
That's true.
There's armed struggles.
Right.
The fact is that people are being beaten down, but the level of brainwashing that exists here, I don't think exists anywhere else in the world, And here, I think there's been a very careful orchestration of the real battle has been the controlling of minds, and the levels of surveillance that Edward Snowden and these people have revealed is just the latest and an increasingly drastic maneuver involved in controlling people. And see, the thing is that in a country like India, the majority of the people live off the grid, outside the grid,
Right.
So in a way, controlling them through these methods of internet surveillance is not possible because they are not on the internet, or it's not a population that can be controlled by the media or by yet. Of course, TV is now made huge inroads, and police officers I speak to keep saying, as long as we have television, everything will be okay. We can control people, we can make them into zombies watching soap operas and so on. But in India, there are people outside of that too, still. But here, I think the understanding that you have to deal with it like you deal with a war is very clear with the government. And the more it increases, the more warlike that strategy of what armies call perception management goes on. And here, perception management is a huge art. I mean, it starts, people blame Islamists for indoctrinating children, but what happens here? I mean, from the time a child opens its eyes, it's being indoctrinated to think that there's no other way of living, there is no other kind of happiness, there's nothing except consumerism that will satisfy the desire of your soul,
Right, you're exactly right. We are speaking with Arundhati Roy. Her most recent book is Capitalism, A Ghost Story. You can find out more by going to haymarketbooks.org. She is appearing in New York on Monday, October 13th. Again, you can find out more information on that by also going to haymarketbooks.org. What does the continual return to inequality, despite it proving to be devastating to the economy, say about the nature of capitalism? Because a couple of weeks ago, we had Slavoj Žižek on the show, and one of the things that he was talking about was the abandonment of the idea of communism. He was pointing out how if somebody wanted to start a communist country, they wouldn't say, hey, the Soviets did nothing wrong. We're going to start right from that place and start all over again. If capitalism is such a great economic system, why do we continue to make the same mistake over and over and over again of inequality?
Well, look, it's not a mistake. It's in the nature of the beast, And this is not to say that communism, in the ways in which it was practiced in the Soviet Union and in China and many other places, have not made mistakes, And I think the question is how do you look for a new imagination? I think that let's say in India, for example, where recently, like as you said, I've written about the system of caste, which is perhaps the most cruel social hierarchical system that the human imagination has come up with, where even today, and it's unlike racism. This is approved in the scriptures. So it has kind of religious sanction. And you have 100 million people who are called untouchables. Untouchables not in the Hollywood sense, but in the physical sense, that these are polluting human beings. And they are 1/3 of the population of the United States. And you look at how it has been entrenched. And yet the communist movement in India, which was significant, could not address it. Did not have the tools, So I think all over the world, the fact is that, the politics of culture and identity and race, these are things that affect people's soul. This is the music, and this is, who you are and what your history is. It cannot be just set aside by class analysis, It's like but then neither can that replace looking at capitalist society or any society through the lens of class. So it's like the heart and the body and the heart and the brain, the soul is race and identity and culture, and the other thing is the skeleton, and one cannot exist without the other. It makes no sense without the other. But I think anti-capitalists have to understand that, because otherwise what has happened, as I write about in Capitalism, A Ghost Story, is that these major corporate foundations like the Rockefeller and Carnegie and to a great extent Ford Foundation, they have cultivated a kind of identity politics, removing that whole part of it which questions economic injustice. And so it becomes a firewall against those who question the economic order at all, and it locks people into these little silos that work as a firewall against any radical questioning. So I think this is a mistake that the left has to address.
We have been speaking with Arundhati Roy. She is author of the new book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story. Arundhati, I've got one last question for you. It's what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience will hate the response. And I want to make sure that our audience understands that even though we've been talking for about a half an hour right now, I've got about 30 more pages of questions for you. Every paragraph I read of your only about a 90, 100-page book, every paragraph I read, I came up with 4 or 5 new questions. This is an amazing book, and everybody, Arundhati's a great writer anyway. Everybody knows about that. But this is a fantastic book. And what she was just talking about, corporate foundations, and the way that they do colonialism nowadays. They're the new proxy. They're the new privatized colonialism, the corporate foundations are, and the impact that they have on everything today, the impact that they have on education here in the U.S. Economist Dean Baker has been on our show talking about how it's almost impossible to get a paper published at a university, an economics paper published at a university that is in any way critical of neoliberal politics because those foundations fund those economic schools. Here in the U.S., as she was pointing out the different foundations, one of the foundations that she mentioned is the Ford Foundation. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday about this, and he said, well, the Ford Foundation does fund some really good things. They fund Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! So he quoted Michael Moore, and Michael Moore once said, why not take that foundation money because those people will give us enough rope to hang them. Is there anything wrong with taking money from these corporate foundations if you're then taking those resources to turn around and burn the people who gave you that money?
Well, I think I think the real understanding that we all must have is that I'm not talking about some pristine position where you have to be pure and because that's not even possible in such a situation.
Right.
But it's very important to understand what's going on, and what of course some of these foundations, certainly Ford Foundation does fund some very, very good stuff, but what we have to look at is when does the radical edge gradually get sanded down, So, of course, it funds some great stuff, and I'm not saying, nobody should take money from them, but I'm just talking about understanding the whole operation, because if you look at what Ford itself says in its own sort of description of what it sees itself as having set out to do. It talks about being an organization that I've forgotten the exact words. I think it's in my novel. I don't want to say something which then isn't accurate, but it did see itself as an organization to defeat communism, to further the interests of the United States, and so you have to look at the history of what it was doing, let's say, in Indonesia. I mean, you all saw the act of killing. What was the Ford Foundation doing at that time? What was the Ford Foundation doing in India? So I'm not talking about individual things. Individually, it's great, and I don't think people should not take money. I'm not saying that at all. But if we do it without understanding the gradual seduction from the edge of the cliff, it's not easy to see exactly what the game is. But all of us are in the game. I'm not a pristine person, and I don't advocate. I don't think that it's even possible. But we have to understand the system because we're all playing in it, And how do we deal with it? Like how do you respond to, for example, in India, the big mining corporations that are the reason for the wars and the massacres going on in central India? They fund literary festivals where people come and talk about free speech, and it's all. They have the money to play both sides.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying people shouldn't take money, but I'm saying how do we talk about limiting the power of these people who can actually make public policy? How do we return to a situation where this kind of conflict of interest, like the big corporation Reliance in India, not only is it own petrochemicals and mining and textiles and internet and all universities and schools, and it owns 27 24-hour TV channels, news channels, So there's a stage where they are funding both. The mining companies who are involved in murdering people in the forest can also be running law schools, and in the law schools they have courses on resistance and the poetry of resistance. So we're living in a lunatic asylum, and at least we must know the the boundaries of our cells.
As long as we know we're living in the asylum, I guess the only thing I have left to ask you, Arundhati, is so do you know how I can get some money from the Ford Foundation?
Sorry, what?
Do you know how I can get some money from the Ford Foundation?
How?
I don't know. I'm trying to ask you. Maybe you have some insight.
No, for example, you could say that, capitalism does have a human face. Look at all the nice things it does.
Oh, sweet. I'll start working on that. I'm going to rehearse that. I'll practice that this week. Arundhati,
big dams are not all that bad.
Right. Hey, one last thing. I do not have your email address. My email address is chuck@thisishell.com. I would love to have you back on the show and for a longer period of time because this is really amazing work. Please email me if you get a chance because I don't have your email address.
Anthony, I guess you know Anthony,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll tell him to send you my email.
All right, excellent, Arundhati. I really appreciate you being on the show with us this morning. Yeah. Truly an honor and a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your weekend in New York.
Thanks, then. Bye.
Bye. This is Hell every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. That went way better than I thought it was going to, and I could have spoken with her for about 80 minutes. And I know, Alex, I'm sorry, we're 6 minutes over, but I started the question from Hell with 4 minutes left. Oy, oy. All right, so let me get to some stuff I got to mention real quick. Question from Hell. The question from Hell for our listeners this week is in honor of last week's Great Chicago Fire Festival. It is, if you could burn anything to the ground until it was nothing but ashes, what would it be? Post your reply to the This Is Hell Facebook page and you will receive the best reply, that is, 2 passes to the new Theodore Oobleck show, Baudelaire in a Box 7, The King of Rain, the 7th installment in Oobleck's epic attempt to translate the entirety of Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs de Mal, features 15 new cantastorias designed and illustrated by This Is Hell correspondent Dave Buchan. It's called The King of Rain, and it happens October 15th through 18th this week, 8 p.m. at the Charnel House, 3421 West Fullerton Avenue in Chicago. $15 suggested donation. More if you've got it, free if you've broke. So why would we be giving out free passes to an event where it's free if you're broke? That's because the winner will also get a special surprise gift upon their arrival at the show. Our responses so far: if you could burn anything to the ground until it was nothing but ashes, what would it be? One of our irregular correspondents, Ladio.com, says, I know I'm not qualified for this contest, but my response would be the Koch brothers tied together at the stake and toasted with their own cash as fuel. Oh, and Karl Rove on a spit. Richard says, Trump Tower, Chicago, that god-awful Trump sign is just begging for an implacable inferno of righteous fury. Figmund says, probably all churches. And Chris says, Western Avenue. Easy one. Later on in this morning's show, we will be telling you who the winner of the question from Hell is this week. And that winner, again, will get 2 free passes to the 7th installment of Theodore Oobleck's attempt to translate the entirety of Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs de Mal, and that's called Baudelaire in a Box, Episode 7, The King of Rain. Happening again October 15th through 18th. That's Wednesday through Sunday, 8 p.m. at the Charnel House, 3421 West Fullerton in Chicago. $15 suggested donation. More if you've got it, free if you're broke. You can find out more by going to theateroobleck.com. Theater Oobleck, that's OOBLECK.com. So we got that taken care of. As I was telling you, today's just a 1-hour show. We are back with 4-hour shows starting on October 18th. This is Hell is broadcast live over the air every Saturday morning right here on WNUR 89.3 FM, Evanston, Chicago's sound experiment. If you've been following the protests in Hong Kong via the National Nightly Network News here in the U.S., you probably know that the protesters are polite and they carry umbrellas. Essentially, if you watch the U.S. news, there's nothing different between these protesters and an army of Mary Poppins. Not that I have anything against Julie Andrews, but I'm starting to think that Dick Van Dyke is a tool of Beijing. As I clearly need to know more, joining us live from Beijing, Tanya Brannigan is China correspondent for The Guardian. Tanya's most recent writing includes this week's article, What's Next for the Hong Kong Protesters? Good morning, Tanya.
Good morning.
It's good evening in Beijing. It's great to have you on the show. Before we get to what caused these protests originally, I'm trying to figure out if this is something that came out of the blue or if this was something that was inevitable. Has the discontent shown by Hong Kong's protesters been simmering for a long time? Because it would seem to me that ever since Hong Kong was no longer a British colony, that this kind of confrontation with Beijing was inevitable.
Well, we've certainly seen a number of really huge protests over the years. Essentially, people have always regarded Hong Kong as being rather politically conservative, really as seeing its future as lying with Beijing, and therefore people as generally being sort of fairly unwilling to challenge. In fact, what we found is that every time Beijing does something to assert its authority, there's suddenly a big backlash. And so what we saw in 2003 were sort of huge protests, 500,000 people on the streets, after there were attempts to introduce new laws on sort of national security and sedition and so forth. And then 2-3 years ago, we saw another huge spate of protests because there was an attempt to introduce something called national education, which was this sort of patriotic education program that the critics really saw as being brainwashing, essentially, by Beijing was their argument. So we've certainly seen very big reactions before. What really amazed people was this sudden outburst of civil disobedience, the speed with which it happened, the sheer scale of it, and the fact that, people said, look, everybody thought Hong Kong people just walked. If there was a problem, they got a protest permit, they went out on the streets and had their say. All of a sudden, they're actually sort of willing to break the law and just take things over, and that's what really startled people.
But it was my understanding, and tell me if I'm wrong, it was my understanding that these protests were far smaller than the ones in 2003, than the education protests in 2011, the protests in 2003 about national security policy that Beijing was trying to impose, education policies in 2011. My understanding was that these protests were far smaller than those past protests, so I didn't understand why Hong Kong or the international community would be surprised by these. I guess I'm missing what is the surprise here.
So I think the differences are that, as you say, we're talking about 500,000 people on the streets in the case of the 2003 protests. What's happened this time is that we've seen a lot of people out, certainly on the peak nights, at least 100,000, I think. But that's happened over many nights. So it's been much more protracted. And secondly, as I've said, people haven't just gone and got a protest permit and said, can we protest? Yes, we can. Thank you very much. And taken to the streets on one day in a very sort of organized and obedient manner. They've actually said, we're just going to do this. We're going to take over this space that we are not supposed to take over. So it's taking it a step further from a sort of registered, organised, permitted protest into doing something that's actually not permitted, into civil disobedience. And it's that step forward that I think really, really surprised people. I think the other thing here is that there is certainly a build-up in the sense of Hong Kong's identity, a sense among many young Hong Kong people that they don't really see themselves as Chinese in the sense of being tied to the state that is China. They see themselves primarily as being Hong Kong people with a sort of culturally Chinese identity. And so there's a sort of backdrop there that has led to this. But this was much more surprising in the way it broke out. Perhaps there wasn't quite the same sort of build-up. There wasn't the same organisation. It had a much more spontaneous feel to it.
As you wrote back on August 31, pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong vowed to take over the city's financial heart in a civil disobedience campaign after China ruled out allowing its residents to freely choose their next leader. Beijing has long promised that the chief executive of the region would be elected by universal suffrage from 2017, prompting Occupy Central and pan-democratic lawmakers to battle for substantial electoral reforms. But Beijing made it clear, again, this is back on August 31st, that it would control the nominating process, and the framework endorsed by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress is particularly tough. It would allow only 2 or 3 candidates and require them to gain the backing of at least half the members of a nominating committee stacked with Beijing loyalists that effectively rules out a Democrat from standing. Why would Beijing offer this promise and then renege on this promise? What should this reveal to us about what's happening internally within domestic politics, within party politics, within the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I think one thing is that when the Basic Law was drawn up, so that's the sort of mini constitution of Hong Kong, essentially when Hong Kong was handed over by the British back to China, they produced a sort of a joint declaration on the handover, and then they produced this sort of mini constitution. And those things were obviously subject to long negotiations. And so when you actually look at the Basic Law, it's quite ambiguous. And so Beijing would say, well, we're just doing what we always said we would. And its opponents say, no, you're not. And part of the reason for that is that the wording has been constructed so that really people can to some extent interpret it as they wish. Now, the critics very understandably say what you're offering us is not universal suffrage. You know, everybody may get their vote, but if you're tightly controlling the candidates that we pick from, if we can only pick from 2 or 3 people who are basically identical in terms of their political views, that's no sort of choice at all. And they're calling it sham democracy, they're calling it Iranian democracy, they have all sorts of insulting terms for it. Now, Beijing says, well, look, in the Basic Law, we always said that we would control it to some degree. You know, we always said that there'd be sort of a nominating committee to evaluate this. But it's certainly a much, much tougher interpretation than people were expecting. And I think there are a couple of things that feed into that. One of them is simply that China feels much stronger now than it did before. And we can see that internationally, but we can also see that domestically in the way that the leadership asserts itself. And so I think from their point of view, they think, well, why wouldn't we do this? You know, this is what we believe in. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party does not believe in Western-style democracy, as it has made very, very clear over the years. I think the second thing is that there sort of is a disconnect, which is that people in Hong Kong thought when they were handed over, they thought, well, we've got this promise of the one country, two systems framework. Now, that's basically what's allowed Hong Kong to have the greater freedoms and the greater autonomy that it has enjoyed. And that's exactly why people can go out on the streets. It's why people can complain in newspapers. It's why they've got an independent judiciary to go to when they have complaints and so forth. And so they thought, you know, well, we've been given this one country, two systems framework. And through that, that's essentially protecting our identity. We can build up this democratic system and will protect Hong Kong's identity for good. Now, I think the way China saw it was rather different, which is, well, there's a 50-year guarantee in there, and that's basically because we've got sort of 50 years to sort of grow closer together, and, you know, you are Chinese and you will be Chinese, and that means that we will rule you as we believe we should.
This is a protest that was, I don't want to say it's only a youth protest because other people have been involved, but the college students are the ones who really drove this protest. And often when it is young people who are involved in a protest, you will hear discussions about the reason that these protests happen is because of downward turn in the economy. When the Arab Spring happened, it almost as if it was dismissive of any of the other concerns that the youth on the street who were protesting, say in Tahrir Square, it almost was almost dismissive of every other cause they had, as if everything was was fueled by their bottom line and their concern for how much money they had in their wallet. How much of this protest can we say, the one that's going on in Hong Kong right now, because they have restarted again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, how much of these protests that are going on today is simply because the economy is turning down?
Well, I think there's certainly an economic element to it, which is not so much about slowing growth as the fact that incomes have really been held down while things like property prices are soaring. And Hong Kong is a place of really massive inequality. If you look at developed countries or developed regions, in the case of Hong Kong, it's one of the most unequal. And we've seen that inequality rise. I think it's at something like a 30-year peak, if I remember correctly. So I think it's not just economic in the sense of how much money have I got in my pocket, but in the sense of who is this system being run for? And one of the young people I spoke to said to me something I sort of thought really sums up the spirit of many people very well. the chief executive does not run this place for the people of Hong Kong. He runs it politically for Beijing, and he runs it practically for the tycoons in Hong Kong. And so there is that sense, really, that the elite in Hong Kong has done very well, and that many other people are being left behind. And so I think that sort of really speaks to that sense that Hong Kong politics is not helping ordinary Hong Kong people. Now, as you say, I mean, it is very much a youthful movement, although it's obviously drawn older people in. But the other thing that sort of really struck me is how directly sort of political a lot of their concerns were, and really to do with identity and who they believe they are. And if you look at the figures from all the sort of research that's been done, what's striking is not just that younger people are much more likely to be critical of the way that Beijing handles Hong Kong and much more likely to be critical of the way that the Hong Kong government handles Hong Kong, but they're also vastly more likely to see themselves as being simply Hong Kong people rather than primarily Chinese or even having a global identity or something of this sort. So they have a very distinctive identity, and I think it's really that moment where they've suddenly said, we don't want to be run in the way that Beijing wants to run us. This is not who we are. These are not the values that we believe in. So it is very much a movement that is about values as much as economic practicalities.
How much of a challenge is it then for reform in Hong Kong when the elite are the ones who are profiting the most, I would imagine, are the ones who are profiting the most from business relations with China, mainland China?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge issue that in all sorts of ways, not just in the dealings with the mainland, but generally there's no sense that there's no question that politically the system is constructed to be run by the elites, essentially, and therefore introducing political changes of any kind are quite difficult, but particularly when it's something to do with the political system and the mainland. I think the other thing in this case that makes this such a difficult battle, I mean, if you look at 2003 at the national security laws, if you look at 2012 and the protests over national education, what's striking there is that protests actually worked, and the Hong Kong government backed down. The laws weren't passed, or the regulations weren't passed, and similarly, the national education scheme didn't go through. But the difference this time is that it's a decision that has not been made officially by the Hong Kong government, with Beijing behind it, but it's actually been explicitly made by Beijing. Now, that really is why, from Beijing's point of view, it can't back down, because this is all about its credibility and its authority. It can't say, oh, the chief executive's got it wrong, thank goodness he's sort of dealt with that, it's not really anything to do with us. It's absolutely identified as being Beijing's decision.
Police originally arrested hundreds of protesters, which drew more protesters out into the streets. Here in the States, the narrative in the nightly national news has been how kind and civil Hong Kong citizens are, even in the way they conduct themselves at protests. Then I hear about violence and arrests from your reporting. How much are those reports of civil protests, if you will, based on, to be honest, what I fear to be an ugly stereotype? I mean, this whole thing in the States these are people carrying umbrellas and they're really nice. It sounds kind of racist to me. I hate to say it. How much of this is stereotype? How much of this is reality?
I have to say it was a staggeringly polite protest. I mean, I've seen protests around the world, and this was without doubt the most extraordinarily, almost comically at times, considerate protests to sort of watch. You had people putting up signs saying apologies for the inconvenience. One of the ones that really amazed me, I ran into a 20-year-old guy at a bus stop one night and said, "What are you doing?" And somebody had spray painted an anti-capitalist slogan across a luxury goods advert, and he said, "Oh, well, we tried to clean it off. It's nothing to do with us. It's just people trying to give us a bad name. We tried to scrub it off, and it won't come off. So we're just taping something across it so it won't offend anybody who walks past." And there really was an extraordinary level of considerateness, politeness, and calm. I mean, when the tear gas grenades started going off on Sunday night, that's often the point at which, even if a protest has been calm, Tempers can clearly flare, things can get very ugly. What struck me is that you were seeing groups of kids sort of surrounding the police, but immediately their hands would go up in the air to say, look, we're not threatening you. We're trying to stop you doing what you're doing, but we're not going to fight back. And that to me was very striking. Now, having said that, obviously there has been violence, in particular on the Friday in Mongkok when we saw people attacking protesters. We now know that some of those have a sort of triad background, a background in organised crime. There's lots of suspicion about whether they were encouraged to do so, whether that be by local shopkeepers or whether that be by other people that they were encouraged to sort of lay into the protesters. So that was certainly very unpleasant. But on the protesters' side, I have to say it wasn't a stereotype. They really were remarkably, remarkably polite, and Mary Poppins would have been proud of them.
I love the callback. Thank you very much, Tanya. Just a couple more questions for you. You reported, or there's this article on Wednesday in the Washington Post, blog post called 4 Reasons Hong Kong's Protests Failed and 4 reasons they didn't. And the writer, and Ishan Taror, he says that the reasons that they failed, just to sum up quickly, is the protest movement is unpopular, it's unsuccessful, it's a leaderless movement, and it wasn't as restrained by police as people were saying it was going to be. And then then you had the chief executive of Hong Kong saying, okay, we will have talks with protesters. The protests seem to simmer down, and that's where the Washington Post blogger comes in and says these seem to have wrapped up. Yesterday, the chief executive of Hong Kong decides that he is not going to have those talks, and tons of people take to the streets again. Do you think that the chief executive of Hong Kong, just like the writer in the Washington Post, underestimated the amount of anger that people still had if these talks were not going to happen?
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated picture because, as you say, really, any time the authorities do anything, it instantly sort of provokes the reaction where more people do come out on the streets. Now, having said that, it's clear that there are people in Hong Kong, quite a lot of people in Hong Kong who object to these protests, not necessarily because of their political views, but also simply they feel, we're trying to get on with our lives. This is messing up our business. This is messing up our traffic. These are not necessarily people earning a lot of money. We're also talking about people like taxi drivers, small stores. So there certainly are ordinary people who now are feeling, this has gone on 2 weeks or so. It's just too long. You've made your point. It's time to go home. But sort of the one thing that really probably is guaranteed to kind of create sympathy is any attempt to crack down on these protests. And so really that initial surge of people we saw onto the streets on the first Sunday and then the Monday, first, as you said, there was a reaction to the student arrests and the fact that the students were held for so long. But then when those sort of extra people went to the street and were then greeted with pepper spray and tear gas grenades, that was really what sparked a great wave of people. And what struck me was how few people I met there who identified themselves with the student groups even, never mind with the original sort of Occupy Central organised civil disobedience movement. They said, we're not with scholarism, we're not with the Students' Federation, we're here to back them up, but we're our own people. Several people said to me, this is not their thing, this is not Occupy Central, this is the umbrella movement, this is our thing. And it really was a very spontaneous movement. And I think from the protesters' point of view, that's its huge strength, but it's also its huge problem, because if you're trying to get into a situation of negotiations, if you have an end game in mind, it's really quite hard to see how the leaders of the movement can resolve this, just as it's hard to see how the Hong Kong government can resolve this, because many people said, we're not going to go home just because the students tell us to. And from a very early stage, the people who are sort of spiritually or the leaders of the movement or who sort of initiated it in some sense, they've been saying from a very early stage, this is out of our control. We don't manage these people. And that's why I think this is going to be so fascinating to see how it plays out.
Tanya, we're going to have to leave it there. You have to read Tanya Brannigan's work at The Guardian, especially what she was just touching on scholarism. Her profile on Joshua Wong, one of the people who is involved in the movement, and the idea of scholarism is something that you definitely have to read. Go to the Guardian website or go to our website. Just click on Tanya's name and it takes you to her whole archive of writing over The Guardian. Fantastic work at The Guardian, and thanks for talking to us today from Beijing, Tanya. This really has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm glad that you've cleared this up so it's not just Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke in my head anymore.
Thanks very much for having me on.
All right, take care. This is Hell. Every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. We're going till right now. Follow us on Twitter at This Is Hell Radio. Like us on Facebook. The winner of today's question from Hell for our listening audience is, where the hell is that guy's name? Richard. Richard, who said that if he was going to burn anything, it would be Trump Tower Chicago. That god-awful Trump sign is just begging for an implacable inferno of righteous fury. Next week on This Is Hell, Katha Pollitt is author of the new book, Pro, Reclaiming Abortion Rights. And we'll also be speaking with Ted Genoways. Ted has a new book out called The Chain, Farm, Factory, and the Fate of Our Food. Then coming up on our October 25th show, Jeremy Scahill will be with us. He is going to be part of a dinner and conversation at the 35th annual dinner celebration for Chicago Area Peace Action. For more information about that event, go to chaipeaceaction.org. I'm your bitter, blind, broke, gap-toothed radio show host, Chuck Mertz. I'd like to thank Alex Jerry for producing this morning's show, and to everybody for listening. There's only one way to get over all of the problems that we have introduced to you on this morning's show. That's by sitting down in the lotus position, turning your palms towards the sky, focusing on that burning white dot in the middle of your forehead, and saying these simple words: everybody's stupid.
My demon is on my butt. My demon talks to me in profanity like a sailor. And my demon tries to knock me down. And my demon tries to put me on a hell ride.